Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I want to thank you so much for coming this evening. You may notice I usually am a little bit more pressed in my dress shirt, but I think for the first time in my life, I may win the award of traveling the furthest to an event because I woke up 2 days ago in Youngstown, Ohio. I woke up this morning watching the frost go over in Jefferson City, Tennessee, and I didn't realize what that 3-lane to 2-lane reduction in 95 does for your travel plans. But I am here, and if you're wondering, well, why is this guy telling me anything about his travel history? Why does it matter? My name is Adam Anderson, and I'm the pastor here at South Jacksonville Presbyterian Church. And on behalf of the leadership of this church and the whole congregation, I welcome you to this very important and very timely conversation about Christian nationalism. I do want to make a couple logistic points here. If you need a restroom, if you head kind of to the door where you entered, there are restrooms there. If you get parched or if you need caffeine at 6:36 at night, there is a water/coffee machine over on the other side opposite from the bathroom, and childcare is provided in the back. So if you need that as well, we're happy to take care of that. This conversation for us at South Jacksonville Presbyterian Church is the third in our inaugural Flourishing Together series. Spanning topics like the war in Ukraine, as well as participating in 9-0 Forward's 200 race conversations that they have aspired to this year, we have made every effort as a church to help the greater Jacksonville community address complex and critical issues with depth and care. And we invite all of you to join us for our next conversation on November 1st, 2022, in partnership with the Interfaith Council of Northeast Florida, to discuss religious diversity in light of the Dobbs versus Jackson decision. If you'd like to keep up with this, because this will continue, we will launch a 2023 lecture series. If you look in front of you in the pews, you will see this nice little bookmark. It is conveniently able to be torn. And so what I'd love for y'all to do is put your name and your email. You don't even need to put your address in your phone. Just your name and your email, and we will put you on our list so that we can keep you up to date with all of the series of events that we're going to continue to have here as we think critically about how to care for our community. Now, as a church, we have made a commitment to seek flourishing for all individuals, irrespective of who they are and what they believe. We've made every effort as a church to put our money where our mouth is, taking seriously the command of Jesus Christ to love God and love neighbor as ourselves. This means at times we must be clear-eyed and unafraid to have critical reflection on where our tradition may cause harm. As Amanda and Kyle both mentioned this morning on First Coast Connect, Christian nationalism can have a devastating impact both to democracies, but also to Christianity, including the local church. If we really believe in the implications of Christ's actions while he was on this earth, then we need to take this threat seriously. So thank you, Amanda, for leading this charge and for helping each of us become more thoughtful as we seek to care for our communities. And now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Kyle Reese, who I've had the pleasure of getting to know, and as the director of OneJax, to begin our conversation this evening. So thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you, Adam, and for the hospitality of this great church that allows us this space to have this important conversation. We got here tonight after a conversation of the Interfaith Committee of the OneJax Institute at the University of North Florida several months ago. And they were talking about the rise of nationalism, specifically the rise of Christian nationalism. And when they charged me to kind of create a conversation for Jacksonville, I knew immediately who I wanted to come and speak. Amanda Tyler is the executive director of the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty. I know in some circles the term religious liberty, the definition has changed, but I assure you that the Baptist Joint Committee has championed the separation of church and state and championed the free exercise of religion, and Amanda is a remarkable leader. Amanda also, a few years ago, played a part in the founding of Christians Against Christian Nationalism. And while we at OneJax are an interfaith organization, we felt it was important for this conversation tonight for Christian folk to respond to the challenge of Christian nationalism. So you will see that as the program develops. When you walked in, you received a card And these index cards are the way that we will facilitate our Q&A tonight. So throughout the evening, as you have a question, and I'll remind you a couple of times, as you have a question, if you'll just jot that down, raise the card and pass it to the end of the aisle, our team will be there to pick those up, and I will be glad to moderate that Q&A at the end of our time together. But again, let me thank South Jax for your hospitality, and on behalf of the OneJax Institute, I thank you for being a part of this time, and I'm pleased to welcome Amanda Tyler, the Executive Director of the Baptist Joint Committee, a graduate of Georgetown University and the University of Texas School of Law. Amanda, welcome to Jacksonville, and we are very glad you're here.
And we think that Christians need to lead the charge in that attack against Christian nationalism. One, because it will be more effective for a Christian-led group to talk about why Christian nationalism is a problem. It will help diffuse that response we get that to speak against Christian nationalism is somehow anti-Christian. And two, we don't feel safe calling out Christian nationalism in our country right now. That got my attention. That there was a privilege that I had just by being Christian, that I could call out Christian nationalism in a way that my Jewish and Muslim and Sikh and Hindu neighbors could not. And so taking that charge, we worked with an ecumenical group to launch an effort called Christians Against Christian Nationalism in July of 2019. And tonight, I'd love to talk to you about how we've come to understand and recognize Christian nationalism, how I have called Christian nationalism the single biggest threat to religious freedom for all. So after I give a short presentation, I'll look forward to some responses and then to be in conversation with you. So first, before we ever start this conversation, we have to have a common understanding. What is Christian nationalism? And the code on this screen will take you to our website, christiansagainstchristiannationalism.org, where you can find later tonight all kinds of resources on this topic. Christian nationalism is a political ideology and a cultural framework that tries to merge our identities as Americans and Christians. Christian nationalism suggests that to be a true American, one has to be Christian, and really white Christian, and really espousing certain political positions on culture war issues. What are the markers of Christian nationalism? Well, one, Christian nationalism relies heavily on a false mythology of the country's founding as a Christian nation. Now, when people use this term of the United States as a Christian nation, they don't usually mean from a demographic sense. I mean, we can admit that we are still, a majority of Americans still identify as Christians, but that's not what they're talking about. They're talking about the United States as a Christian nation that was founded by Christians in order to privilege Christianity, that God has a special role for the United States and God's plan for the world, that God's providential hand has been at work in our history and is at work in our present politics. This ideology, this mythology, is problematic for a couple of reasons. Well, first, it's just false, right? It contradicts the history and the constitutional text of the United States. You see, the founders made a deliberate choice to form a secular government and to disestablish religion. They came from a background where we had government-sponsored religion, where we had established religion in the colonies, and that was something they did not want for the new country. And so in the founding of the country and the founding document, the U.S. Constitution, Christianity is never mentioned. That's pretty peculiar. If you're forming a Christian nation, why wouldn't you mention Christianity in your founding document? Religion or religious is mentioned exactly once in the U.S. Constitution, in Article 6, where the founders said there would be no religious test for public office. Again, peculiar. If you're setting up a Christian nation, why would you prohibit any religious test in order to hold public office? And then, of course, we have the First Amendment to the Constitution. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. These two clauses, the No Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause, work together to protect everyone's religious freedom. It says that government will stay out of religion so that religion in all of its manifestations can flourish in the public square. But not only does this Christian nation myth belie history and the constitutional text, but it also works against a Christian understanding of a global church. In John's gospel, God so loved the world, right? Not the United States. You know, the United States wasn't even a political entity, of course, at the time of John's gospel, but this idea that America is singled out for special treatment by God goes against the gospel itself. Now, Christian nationalism, another marker of it, is that it can sometimes look like an exaggerated form of civil religion. And in the conversation that Kyle and I had this morning on the local NPR station, this question came up. Well, what about God bless America? Or what about in God we trust? Is that Christian nationalism? Well, often those terms work more like civil religion, just examples of mentioning God in somewhat of a generic way in our public discourse. But the problem is when those mottos or those mantras are used as a form of exclusion, as in, you're only part of our country if you say these words. If you don't believe in God we trust, then you aren't an American. And so we can take these markers of civil religion and expand them in ways that can lead us to Christian nationalism. Well, when we talk about Christian nationalism, we also have to be very exact in our language. And I think one of the first areas I want to be clear about is, well, what does Christian nationalism have to do with Christianity? And right now in our public discourse, I'm hearing things on two different ends of the spectrum. On one end of the spectrum, I hear, well, Christianity has nothing to do with Christian nationalism, right? If you're espousing Christian nationalism, then you aren't a Christian. Okay, I hear that at one end. At the other end, I hear, isn't Christianity just Christian nationalism? Isn't that all there is to it? And I think as often there is more nuance, and it's somewhere in the middle. But this is how I understand it on the next slide. Christian nationalism is a political ideology and a cultural framework. When I talk about a cultural framework, I'm talking about a collection of myths and traditions, symbols, narratives, and value systems. Christianity is a religion practiced by millions of people around the world in different expressions and iterations. It's been around for 2,000 years, okay? So I do think it is important that we think about these things as distinct. But of course, Christian nationalism and Christianity do intersect. The Christian in Christian nationalism is less about religion or theological views and more about an identity. And this Christian identity carries with it assumptions about nativism, white supremacy, authoritarianism, patriarchy, and militarism. But it uses the language and the symbols of Christianity. Crosses, Bible verses, images of Jesus, all of these things are all mixed up in this ideology of Christian nationalism. Christian nationalism as an ideology and cultural framework is not new. It's been around since before the founding of the country. I think we can trace it historically back to the doctrine of discovery and all the way through, and it was certainly put more into its current formation right after the founding of the country. So this ideology of Christian nationalism has been running through our country this whole time. It has infected American Christianity. We have to acknowledge that our expression of Christianity in the United States has been impacted by Christian nationalism. And in some communities, Christian nationalism has so infected Christianity, I think it can be hard to tell the difference between the two. That said, I still think that there is separation between the religion of Christianity, the gospel of Jesus, and this political ideology of Christian nationalism. Another, I think, important distinction that we need to talk about, and it's one that came up in a question this morning, is what's the difference between patriotism and nationalism? Because that's a response I get a lot talking about Christian nationalism. Well, I'm a Christian, but what's wrong with being a patriot too? In which case I say nothing, as long as it stops at patriotism and doesn't go all the way over to nationalism. So patriotism I define as love of country, and that can be expressed in many different ways. Saluting the flag, saying the Pledge of Allegiance, protesting in the streets, protecting your neighbor's religious freedom as your own. These are all different ways to show that you are a patriotic American. Voting, helping other people to vote. Nationalism is a love of country and allegiance to country that demands allegiance over everything else, including our religious allegiances. And so if patriotism requires one to sacrifice their theological convictions, it is no longer patriotism. It has become nationalism. And so when we talk about Christian nationalism, it's very important not to lose a healthy sense of patriotism in the process. I don't think that fighting Christian nationalism requires us to stop being patriots. Quite the opposite, as we talk about tonight, because Christian nationalism is such an urgent threat to American democracy, I believe that patriotism requires us to fight against Christian nationalism. Well, Christian nationalism is an ideology that has been studied for many years by sociologists. And tonight I want to share with you work by two of the leading sociologists of religion who have studied this topic, Andrew Whitehead and Samuel Perry, who wrote a book called Taking America Back for God, Christian Nationalism in the United States, that was published in 2020. And in working on this topic, Drs. Whitehead and Perry, their methodology is that they had a survey that they would give to respondents, and then they would take the survey responses as well as individualized interviews and mark respondents as to how much they embrace or reject Christian nationalism. So you might ask, well, how do you measure someone for Christian nationalism? Well, they give them statements such as these three here and ask the respondents how much they disagree or agree with them. The statements here are: the federal government should declare the United States a Christian nation, that the success of the United States is part of God's plan, the federal government should advocate Christian values. And then they take the responses and developed a scale of Christian nationalism, measuring different orientations. Those who most disagreed with the statements are rejectors of Christian nationalism. Those who most agreed with the statements are what they called ambassadors of Christian nationalism. And then those somewhere in the middle were resistors or accommodators. Three important points that I want to make about this research. One is that Christian nationalism is an ideology and a scale, not, as Dr. Perry has said, a diagnosis. Okay? It's not that you're either a Christian nationalist or you're not. It operates like racism in that way. It's not like you're a racist or you're not. It's an ideology that impacts us all and that we either embrace or reject in different degrees. Second, I want to point out that the smallest share, now this was in 2020, and we'll need to see what their updated research would look like now, but in 2020, the smallest share of Americans were the ambassadors of Christian nationalism. This, and what is otherwise a pretty bleak presentation tonight, I think is good news, right? That we have here, about a fifth of the country that would be marked as ambassadors of Christian nationalism. And the majority, which are the two pieces of the pie on the bottom of the pie chart there, it's about 60%. those are somewhere in the middle. Those are either resistors or accommodators. And that tells me that we all have work to do to move people around the pie chart to become more and more rejectors of Christian nationalism. Well, I say that maybe the news has gotten worse since 2020 because of a new poll that was just released in September on Christian nationalism. This was released by Politico out of the University of Maryland Critical Issues poll. And in this poll, they asked participants first this question: would the Constitution allow the United States to declare itself a Christian nation? And the results were 70% of Americans got the right answer. Again, pretty encouraging. No, the U.S. Constitution does not allow the country to declare itself a Christian nation. Also good news that when you looked at that politically, that both majorities of Democrats and Republicans got the answer right. But then they asked the follow-up question. They asked the respondents, do you favor or oppose the United States officially declaring itself a Christian nation? We fell down from 70% of Americans here to 62% said no, they would oppose the United States declaring itself a Christian nation. But when you drop and look at the political by party on this question, that was 83% of Democrats, but just 39% of Republicans. So that means that 61% of Republicans who responded to this poll support the United States declaring itself a Christian nation, even though a majority of those same Republicans know it is unconstitutional. So they are willing to violate the Constitution to declare the United States a Christian nation. This information is not just bearing itself out in polls, but also in the political discourse, because around the same time that this poll was taken, there were statements first from Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene, who declared that she was proud to be a Christian nationalist. She then quickly started selling T-shirts that said, "Proud Christian Nationalist." We also had Representative Lauren Boebert around the same time saying that it was the job of the church to control the state and direct the state, and that she was tired of separation of church and state. We also had Andrew Torba, an extremist political commentator, who went on his radio show and said that this is a Christian country, that we should have Christian laws. He said, I'm not saying that we'll deport Jews, but they're going to have to learn to live in a Christian country. It might be tempting to reject these statements as just extremists. The problem is they were met with no meaningful response from mainstream Republicans in their own party. And this is a problem because if they're not countered, then we are at risk of normalizing Christian nationalism. We also need to talk about white Christian nationalism and how Christian nationalism operates in conjunction with racism. This is a statement and how we talk about it at Christians Against Christian Nationalism. We say that Christian nationalism often overlaps with and provides cover for white supremacy and racial subjugation. White Christian nationalism creates and perpetuates a sense of cultural belonging that was limited to the people who were included in society at the founding of the United States, namely native-born white Christians. Christian nationalism also operates like racism. It's pervasive and touches every aspect of our culture. And that poll out of Politico and the University of Maryland, they also had this finding. They found that white grievance is highly correlated with support for a Christian nation. White respondents who say that members of their race have faced more discrimination than others are more likely to embrace a Christian America. They found that roughly 59% of all Americans who say white people have been discriminated against a lot more in the past 5 years favor declaring the United States a Christian nation, compared to only 38% of all Americans. White Republicans, who said white people have been more discriminated against, also favored a Christian nation, 65%, by a slightly larger percentage than all Republicans, 63%. Why is this? What about the Christian nation narrative, the Christian nation myth, includes all of this coded understanding of racism? Here's some of my thoughts on that. One, the Christian nation myth includes, of course, slavery. If you're going to say that God's providential hand was at work in the founding of the country, you can't stop and say, except for that slavery thing, right? So Christian nation imbues God's favor on slavery, on racial violence, on segregation. And in this way, people can use the language of Christian nationalism as code in exchange for more explicitly racist language and imagery. Here's an example. From the state of Mississippi, in 2020, the voters voted to remove the Confederate battle flag from their state flag, finally. But the legislature of the state of Mississippi said, in order to put that up as a ballot initiative, that they had to replace it with "In God We Trust." The only way they were going to take the Confederate battle flag off was to put the words "In God We Trust" on their state flag. They're trading explicit imagery for this more coded, implicit language that can take a place of it. And the problem of many is that when it's so coded, it is so much more difficult to deal with, right? That it becomes more deeply embedded, and it's more difficult to notice it and to deal with it and ultimately to dismantle it. We also see white Christian nationalism, and I know you all are experiencing this here in Florida, at the local level, when we see pushback against schools teaching about slavery and racism, when we find that schools would rather teach a Christian nation myth than a more candid assessment of American history. So I've laid out kind of how to understand Christian nationalism. I'd like to talk now about how it shows up in our culture. Sometimes it's really obvious. This is a picture from January 6th, insurrection. The QR code here goes directly to a report that Baptist Joint Committee did in conjunction with the Freedom from Religion Foundation on Christian nationalism in the January 6th insurrection. This report is the most complete report to date that I know of, documenting the instances of Christian nationalism, not just on January 6th itself, but in the events leading up to January 6th. And we have a number of contributors to the report, highly documented and footnoted report. It has been an incredible resource, I think, for the public to understand January 6th and Christian nationalism, and it has also been a report that's been used by members of Congress, including members of the January 6th committee. Now, our argument in this report is not that Christian nationalism alone can explain what happened on January 6th. But we say you cannot understand what happened on January 6th without dealing with Christian nationalism. That's because Christian nationalism was used to unite a disparate group of actors in a common cause and to ordain their actions with religious significance. Christian nationalism, as I've talked about at its heart, is anti-democratic because it creates these second-class citizens based on religion. And we saw on January 6th what an urgent threat to American democracy Christian nationalism is when we came so close to having lawful election results overturned. I think it is imperative that we talk about and notice Christian nationalism when it shows up in these really obvious ways, in ways that threaten American democracy. And I think we have to stay awake to examples of Christian nationalism that might seem less extreme, but are more insidious because they're chipping away at religious freedom for all. I want to tell you now next about a project called Project Blitz. Project Blitz is a playbook that is put out by something called the Congressional Prayer Caucus Foundation. For several years, they have been mailing their playbook, or emailing, I guess, or putting it online to all of the state legislatures across the country, urging them to pass a series of bills that are all influenced by Christian nationalism. And one of their bills, and several states have passed this bill, require the posting of "In God We Trust" in public schools. Now, the question is not always, is this constitutional? That's not the question that we're trying to answer. We're trying to answer the question, does this further religious freedom for all? And I would say that this bill does not do that. Why? Well, "In God We Trust," of course, it's a national motto. As we talked about earlier, it is a marker of civil religion. But here's where the playbook takes this marker of civil religion and makes it into an instrument of Christian nationalism. In the playbook itself, it talks about the importance of why legislatures should pass this bill. It said that the measures in this category of bills recognize that religion, and particularly our Judeo-Christian heritage, have played a large part in the founding and history of this country, perpetuating the Christian nation mythology. They say it is important for our citizenry, especially young students, to be educated about these topics in order to appreciate and understand the principles on which our country is based. Read, "You can't be an American if you don't understand and appreciate that we trust in God here." Without an understanding of the basic religious dimension of our history and civics, our citizens are not as able to assess and act on the various public policy concerns that we face now and in the future. And then they're very transparent. Even if bills like these are not enacted, it can shore up later support for other governmental entities to support religious displays. And these bills in this Project Blitz playbook, they build on each other. The next slide shows kind of the progression that we would have from one bill to the other. And this is what's so important, that we have to understand some of these more mundane bills perpetuate a narrative that can lead to more extreme bills that continue to privilege Christianity in ways that create a second-class status for minority religions and for the growing number of Americans that don't claim a faith tradition. The next bill in this cycle here are these Bible literacy bills. These are bills that are not meant to teach about religious diversity or about just having religious literacy, which I think is very important for an educated citizenry, but rather about the Bible in particular. And this is more, I'm reading from the Project Blitz playbook here. "The importance of our Christian heritage to the institutions, values, and vision of our nation is immeasurable, and teaching our children about the spiritual values of our Christian heritage will help them understand and appreciate our nation's history." This shows that this is an explicitly Christian nationalist ideology that is driving these bills and that are being passed and pushed by state legislatures across the country. So I've talked some about what Christian nationalism does to our democracy, to our equal citizenship, including in our public schools for our youngest citizens. What does Christian nationalism do to Christianity? This slide is a cautionary tale for Christian nationalism. It explains what happens when the government co-opts Christian symbols. This is a picture taken from Bladensburg, Maryland, right outside of Washington, D.C. It's a little hard to tell in the perspective, but that cross is 40 feet high, and it's on a traffic island that is owned by the government. It was erected shortly after World War I, and a few years ago, the American Humanist Association brought suit challenging the government's upkeep of this cross as an establishment of religion. The case went all the way to the United States Supreme Court. The court actually upheld the constitutionality of this cross. I can talk about the legal specifics of that case, but the point for Christian nationalism is this. Again, the question is not, is this constitutional, but does the policy further religious freedom for all? In upholding the constitutionality of, in debating the constitutionality of this cross, the government made a really remarkable argument. The government made the argument that the cross is not a religious symbol. Yeah, let that sink in. They said the cross is a generic symbol of sacrifice, not carrying religious meaning. So the Baptist Joint Committee, in conjunction with other Christian groups and Jewish groups, filed a brief with the United States Supreme Court that was much more theology than legal argument. We explained the religious significance of the Christian cross, and we explained how it was deeply offensive to both us as Christians and for our Jewish signers, for Jews, to say that the cross has no religious significance. In fact, it is the central symbol of Christianity. And to strip the cross of its religious significance is deeply offensive and threatens our religious freedom. Well, fortunately, the Supreme Court did not buy the government's argument. They did acknowledge that the cross was a religious symbol, but they limited this cross to its historical facts, and they said that it could stay. They also had language that suggests that it would not be constitutional to erect new crosses. I will say as a footnote, this case was from 2019. I have a harder problem today in 2022 being so sure that this Supreme Court would make the same decision now. But this is a cautionary tale for what happens when you have Christian nationalism. What happens to Christianity? The government gets to start telling you what your religion means. And this is something that I think we can take to heart about what could happen if we had rampant Christian nationalism take over the government in this country, which is something that we're having to talk about now. Well, finally, I want to talk about what Christian nationalism looks like in churches. And I have a slide here. I walked in, and I have to say that I was pleased to see that the American flag is over here on the side and not on the altar as it is in the picture here. When I give this presentation, and I've been giving this presentation on Zoom mostly, this is always where the chat feature on Zoom just lights up. Everyone has a story about an American flag in a church. The point here is that, and this is the point of Christians against Christian nationalism too, we are not about pointing fingers out into the broader world. We are about looking inside of ourselves and our theology and on our worship practice and asking ourselves this question: how much of what we are worshiping and our practice, how much of this is Christianity and how much of this is Christian nationalism? I think it was Andrew Whitehead, one of the sociologists, he put on Twitter one time, here's a great test for how much Christian nationalism you have in your church. Try taking out the American flag and see what happens. Again, this is what does that say about our theology and what we're worshiping and how central our American identity is to our religious identity to have this symbol in our house of worship. And I am not here tonight or in any of these presentations to tell any congregation what to do. I am a Baptist. I believe that every congregation should be deciding for themselves how they worship and what they do here. But I am asking congregations to have the conversation about what this means, about what Christian nationalism is, to look inside. And on the final slide here, this kind of leads us to what can we do about this. And at Christians Against Christian Nationalism, we have assembled, and the QR code here, again, takes you back to Christians Against Christian Nationalism. We've assembled a library of resources for congregations who want to delve into these topics. We have a podcast series with a discussion guide. We have webinars with discussion guides that can be used as curriculum in small groups. We have one-pagers and explainers, and all of this is free to access for anyone. They were created specifically for Christian communities in mind, but I think they are really useful for people from interfaith and from non-religious backgrounds who can show people to be against Christian nationalism is not to be against Christianity. Quite the opposite. We think it is crucial for a flourishing Christianity and a healthy American democracy that we fight Christian nationalism. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Amanda, and we trust that Amanda's comments have triggered some questions within you, and so we want you to use those index cards. Again, if you will hold them up, pass them to the end of the aisle, our team will pick them up. We wanted to have two brief responses tonight as a local flavor of Jacksonville, and so I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Chris McKee and Reverend Rebecca Hutto. Chris is the senior pastor of the Church of Oakland, and Rebecca is the new executive director of the Interfaith Center of Northeast Florida. So Chris will come and offer a brief response, then followed by Rebecca, and then we will spend the rest of our time this evening in question and answer. Chris?
Good evening, everyone. I'm sure all of our minds are stirring. I had a few notes down, and I found myself writing additional notes just to take in this information. One of the ideas that stuck for me even prior to the speech tonight is this whole notion of myth. And I thought it was so remarkable that right at the beginning of this lecture, we jumped into this conversation around myth. And I like to define myth as the stories people tell themselves about themselves to explain themselves. Okay? And we know that myth plays such a big role in how society and cultures work. And what's so unique about this myth of Christian nationalism, especially for an African American Baptist, is that it paints this story that this country was somehow founded with one specific religious instinct. And if you study any history, now I am not a historian, I have an undergraduate degree in history. I've done a lot more theology than history at this point, but I try to bring a little bit of that to bear. One of the things you want to always think about is I was challenged, and some folks might have had an opportunity to hear him when he was last here in the area several months ago. Dr. Eddie Glaude in a seminary class challenged us and asked us what was the religion of the founders. In the group of seminarians, we all quickly said, Christians. And he said, no, they weren't necessarily Christians. They were deists and theists. So the framers of the very language that this nation calls its founding documents, these were not necessarily Jesus-believing Christians. These were deists and theists who believed there was a God out there somewhere who kind of put everything into motion. But this whole notion of this very evangelical perspective, and let me be clear, as a Baptist, I come out of an evangelical tradition. I believe every time I get done preaching, every Sunday morning, I want somebody to walk that aisle and make a decision for Jesus. I absolutely do. But that language even itself has been co-opted to mean something that goes beyond a theological position to a political position. And that's all part of this myth. That is not true. It's a story we tell ourselves to explain ourselves to ourselves, right? So how do you do this? Well, you build it around symbols and rituals and behaviors. And what has become so problematic, and probably one of the most disturbing things as an African-American Christian who feels that his particular understanding of this faith has been built on the shoulders of thinkers of liberation and freedom, figures like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., figures like Howard Thurman, figures like Sojourner Truth, figures like Jarena Lee, people all throughout our historical narrative who utilize their Christian faith as a means to not only build out the faith of Jesus, but change people's lives. What happens when that very language becomes language of subjugation and oppression, which sadly has been so much a part of this nation's fabric, which builds into this myth. So it makes it okay then for us to somehow make this false idea that to be racist to be complicit in systems and structures of oppression makes you Christ-like, when for me, that's the antithesis of who Jesus is. One of my favorite professors, Dr. Emily Towns, in that same class, actually, it was a joint lecture between the both of them. Can you imagine that? If anybody knows anything about African-American theology and larger studies around womanism and ethics, to have both Dr. Towns and Dr. Glaude sitting at a table at the same time, it stuck in my mind that much that I still remember that moment some almost close to 20 years later. The challenge was to think about how this great hegemonic imagination, as Dr. Towns calls it, is this idea that there is this story out here that fuels supremacy that's based on these myths, that somehow or another to be white and Christian makes you superior, which brings me to my charge. My charge tonight was to respond to how do we look at Christian nationalism and white supremacy as kissing cousins, as having this kind of symbiotic relationship where they're connected to one another. Well, if you push a narrative that says somehow or another to be white and Christian makes you superior, then it's not hard then to caboose that to racism, right? It's not hard to make an easy fix there, that if you are white and Christian and superior, then you can oppress everybody doesn't fit in those boxes, even folks who might share your same faith background but don't share your same racial background, which has been pretty much the story of African American Christianity. You know, folks often talk about how Sunday is the most segregated hour in America. Well, you know, it didn't always start out that way, but it became that way because of how racism and structures work. If we want to look at those of us who are kind of products of the Great Awakenings, Baptist folks and Methodist folks and Presbyterians, and at least if you come out of that revival tradition, you know, a lot of these movements started out multiracial. A lot of these movements started out with a sense of some egalitarianism, though we would argue there was probably always a little bit of racism in there, because racism, I don't care what anybody says, and I hope I don't get in trouble for this, Kyle, tonight, but anybody who tries to divorce the nation of racism or suggest that racism is not a part of the structural fabric of this country is not telling the truth. It's not true. We might not like it, we might not be comfortable with it, but it's not the truth. We know the whole notion of racial categorization, especially accompanied by slavery, was a part of the economic engine that built this country. We know that. It's the truth, regardless as to what anyone says. And you've got to have a myth to support that. And what easier myth to use than faith, right? To take faith and to make it into something that becomes a source of division instead of unity. And if you trickle on down even to the neo-charismatic movements or the Pentecostal movements of the late 1800s into the early 1900s, these started out also as multiracial movements, even gendered movements of gender equality. That's a whole nother conversation for a whole other day, right? How there's a relationship between racism and patriarchy and how all these pieces work out. But if there is a relationship between the two, which I think there is, one of the big things becomes how do we as Christians, and I'm not always one to say we have to start a dialogue. I don't think it's always a dialogue. I think there's a need for truth-telling. I think there's a need for those of us who for a long time in my life, felt very comfortable saying without any shame I was an evangelical. Until later on, I started to feel like this title doesn't match me anymore, although it very much matches my religious background, because the ways in which right Christian nationalism has hijacked that term to mean something that I don't believe. That somehow or another you have to subscribe to a particular set of beliefs, a particular way of interpreting Christ, which I don't think runs congruent to the Jesus we see in the Gospels. So here we go. Something else that really stuck out of the talk tonight was the whole piece around the symbol of the cross. I think we all kind of took a collective gasp there, right? But I don't think that's that foreign. I mean, if we look at even the history of the Ku Klux Klan and the burning of the cross, right, it divorces it of its sacrificial meaning and turns it into something else. That's no longer about Jesus' sacrifice as a brown Palestinian man, right? Dying at the access of imperialism and religion, right? I mean, that's what our Bibles tell us if we look at it closely enough, right? That is the ultimate symbol of love, sacrifice, and for those of us who believe in atonement theology, the very central piece of what we believe as Christians. And it's blasphemous for it to be called not a symbol of religion and to be treated as something to be burned and a sign of hatred, when it's the ultimate sign of love and reconciliation for those of us who ascribe to that particular sort of belief. So, here we go. Here we stand in an age where a lot of the conversations we're having right now, whether it's about the conversations we have in school, whether it's about the right to vote, whether it's about the extension of rights in this country versus its restrictions. And we have to have a very honest conversation about what type of Christianity are we going to adhere to? Will it be one that forces us into more boxes of division without effective truth-telling? Or will it be one that honors the reality that Jesus of Nazareth, who I believe to be the Son of God, who I believe to be the Redeemer of the world, who I believe to be the Savior of all humanity, was one who came to liberate and not subjugate, and not to be the superhero of one particular cultural position, right? To be the Redeemer of all humanity, which means implicit in that is an acceptance of diversity that brushes up against this relationship between nationalism and white supremacy, which we see, which is interesting. And if I could say this, as a good African-American Baptist, it doesn't stop in the racial categories either. It permeates into every part of our culture. So I grew up in VBS pledging allegiance to the American flag and the Christian flag too, right? And so what does that say then to a young African American about what it means to be American when if the definition of American is white and Christian and you don't fit that box, how do you fit into the democratic process that's supposed to engage all people? I think that's a really big piece we have to talk about. How has this worked on the soul and psyche of our nation, that we are lifting these lines of distinction instead of necessarily understanding how, if Christianity is a religion, a world religion, a religion that is concerned about all people, then it cannot be connected to one particular racial group, and it certainly cannot be connected to a scheme of supremacy. I think that's all I have to say for tonight. Hope that was helpful.
You would make me follow the preacher, right? Because you came up here to preach. Thank you, Amanda. Thank you, OneJax, and thank you, SouthJax, for hosting this conversation. I have to say I'm a Presbyterian Christian. That's my brand of Christianity. But I am married to a Baptist pastor, and my crush on the Baptist is that they get this issue of separation of church and state. They get it better than the rest of us do. And so I appreciate your words and your wisdom and all that you're bringing to this conversation. As the executive director of the Interfaith Center of Northeast Florida, I'm going to also tag team and say the big issue with Christian nationalism and interfaith dialogue is this myth that we are all from one religion, which denies the pluralism that existed in this country when it was founded, before it was founded, and denies the pluralism that exists now. I love your word, it's just fake. Could we say that the historical narrative that we were a Christian nation is fake news? Can we say that? It denies the pluralism that existed in the beginning of this country. And I should also say, as someone who represents only one branch of Christianity, Christian nationalism has severely fractured just the Christian church, in the sense that even to say Baptist, there's a lot within that definition that would agree with everything that you said and that would oppose everything that you said. As we watch the Queen's funeral and we see religion and monarchy united together, we are in a country where that is separated. And there's a variety of different Christian views on that. But as the director of the Interfaith Center, when we deny that pluralism existed in the very beginning, we deny that pluralism exists now, which means we don't have to interact with any other religion, any other non-religious person who doesn't think and act like us. And one of our values at the Interfaith Center is interfaith literacy, as you said, religious literacy. It is a value to our citizenry to know the pluralism that exists around us, in our neighbors, in our schools, in our friends and family. And this revisionist history makes that kind of dialogue and that kind of literacy impossible. I'll also add to it that where we value in our organization, we value interfaith literacy, I think in the view in Christian nationalism, There is no interfaith dialogue because it's all about conversion. It's you have to think like me, you have to act like me, you have to be this specific model, as you were saying. And so interfaith literacy is kind of a non-issue for Christian nationalists because they believe, well, no, everyone needs to be converted to our point of view, and it stops the conversation altogether. The other core value that we have at the Interfaith Center is mutual curiosity. And it was really interesting to me post 9/11, or just post when the shooting happened in the synagogue, as people in cities started to get together in interfaith gatherings and realized, oh, you go to the temple down the street, and I didn't even know you went to the temple. I didn't even know there was a temple there. Or you went to the mosque over here. I didn't even know how your community celebrates. That kind of mutual curiosity where we see each other, we interact with each other, we want to interact with each other, that is a goal of Interfaith Center, because that's what starts the partnerships and the relationships that can happen in interfaith dialogue. And to me, Christian nationalism just shuts it all down with this myth, as we were all created from one form of Christianity in this country. Again, going back to my crush on the Baptist, I'll have to quote Thomas Jefferson in his letter to the Danbury Baptist on January 1st, 1802. He said, "Their legislature should make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state." This is Thomas Jefferson. I currently am a parent of a 7th grade child here in Duval County, and I am closely watching the lessons that she's coming home from her civics class. As many of you have followed, this news is taking heavy precedence within the curriculum in the Florida schools. And I have heard stories already of things that are changing, but I have heard stories that that wall that Jefferson referred to between separating church and state maybe could be a fence. Maybe it could be something that could be torn down just a little bit. So it's infiltrating the very classroom in which our children are in, and what I would like to see happen is celebrate the diversity, the pluralism that's around us, learn from our neighbors, get to know our neighbors, celebrate our differences, because at the end of the day, the religious diversity that founded this country is one of its greatest gifts. So thank you.
So again, if you have questions, if you would raise those cards, and I'm going to invite our 3 speakers to come. And we want to spend a few moments in question and answer time. Thank you so much for your thoughtful questions. I can tell that many of you learned your handwriting at the same school that I did, and so I will do the very best I can to. One question, though, and Amanda, I'll start with you. This is a pretty heavy conversation. Obviously, if we want to look at where do we find hope, we look around this room. But as you look in the national scope and your work with Christians against Christian nationalism, where do you find hope and energy that speaks against what we talked about tonight?
Yeah, I think it's really important that we don't just stay awake to the urgent threat, but look around and see what's holding us up. When we launched Christians, I'll go back to 3 years ago, when we launched Christians Against Christian Nationalism, we basically put up a website. And we didn't do a lot of fanfare, and we just saw what kind of response we got. And we got an instant response of nearly 10,000 people coming in the first 10 days and saying, this is who I want to be. And when in the last few months, the media has gotten much more interested in this topic than they ever had been before. That's because we started having these really extreme comments coming from extreme members of the Republican Party talking about Christian nationalism. And, the response, though, we can get kind of disheartened by that it takes extremism for the media to cover it. But the response that I've gotten is mostly from the Christian community, well, from both. But first from the Christian community, I'm so grateful to find someone who's saying what I've been thinking this whole time, right? So there is the response that I get, I would say, from the Christian community is, 90% yes, this is what I believe. And so I think that there is this majority of people out there who are horrified by what's going on, and that we need to build that community and people to find their place to find hope there. And also, I would just say from the interfaith and non-religious perspective, what our advocacy means to them, and the kind of Christian witness that we're able to show about our care for others. And the responses that I've gotten of just, feeling really loved and cared for by our interfaith and non-religious neighbors who haven't always felt that from Christians in the culture. So those are hopeful signs that I do think that we have what it takes in our communities to fight back against Christian nationalism if we will work together and bind together against the threat.
I want to ask a follow-up question of you, Amanda, and then I have a question for Chris. The question from one of our attendees tonight: how do we create a religious literacy among our youth within the education system?
There are resources out there, and I know that the interfaith groups here tonight can speak to that and probably have curricula that could be used in these sources. But I can speak specifically to a program called the 3 R's program that I know is in Georgia. I don't know if they've come to Florida yet, but it's out of the First Freedom Center that used to be associated with the museum in Washington, D.C. And this is a particular program and curriculum that has been used to teach public school teachers how to teach religious literacy in the public schools. And I do think that a well-rounded civics education should include religious literacy. Again, not teaching from a devotional theological perspective, but teaching about the robust religious diversity and pluralism that, as Rebecca said, has been in this country since our beginning, and to understand and to have that cultural literacy to be able to operate in the United States that we have. So I, seek out these resources, check out the 3 R's curriculum. I'm sure that there are others, but be careful when you hear about Bible literacy bills. That's not the same as religious literacy bills.
Chris, I want you to respond to this question, if you would. What is the place for religious entities at the table of public political discourse and our political life together?
Wow. I'm wondering why I got that question now. I think in spaces like this, I think, I think one of the frightening things that has happened is because conversations around faith have become so polarizing as a result of Christian nationalism, there isn't much room for faith voices to provide the serious, here's the thing that faith does, and I think this is something interesting. Faith can provide a frame for the world that allows us to think beyond policy and people, and I think that's really important, but it allows us to think about what the world could be like. And so if you have people of faith being able to sit and have public discourse and be in conversation with policymakers in a way that isn't grounded so much in trying to sway to a particular position, but speak of what our societies can look like. So, think even in our Christian language, we have this language of beloved community, which is not about exclusion and not about tearing down folks. It's about building out opportunity. It's about creating more space. It's about extending love. And I think that is really important when that language can come into the public square in a way that is not done to dismiss someone else. I don't know if I'm answering that question exactly how the person wants it or needs it asked, but I think that's the unique perspective that faith voices can bring. And if we are saying, and I think what, something that was said earlier that's really interesting is, if we're stuck on Christian nationalism being the voice of Christianity, that's discounting even a whole lot of Christian voices, let alone other faiths. It's just counting the majority of Christian voices. So we can't even have a real conversation about how many Christians view the world, because it's co-opted by this small minority of people who want to see Christianity look a particular type of way in this country.
Thank you. Rebecca, you mentioned education in Florida and civics education. So I have a question that I'll begin with you, and then Amanda, you might want to add on to this. What suggestions would you have for teachers caught behind policies promoting Christian nationalism, but who are staunchly opposed to such ideas?
Don't teach them. I know just my daughter's school is an art school, and I watched as the arts teachers had to take down all of their safe space stickers and LGBTQ inclusion stickers. They had to really clean out their rooms, and I've seen some pushback on that as well. I don't know that set civic standards have exactly come out, but I've heard from just my own children's teachers that the lack of clarity on the material that has been presented, even math was revised to a point because some of the math textbooks were seen to have included things that the state government didn't like, that they didn't get those resources until the week before. And so what I've tried to do as a parent is just support the teachers, love on the teachers, see if I can help the teachers. I think finding curriculum like what you have mentioned, but I think teachers should feel free to say as their own patriotic duty, this isn't okay for me to teach. But we are losing teachers at a fast rate in this state because of what's going on. The anecdote that I shared is one of my daughter's current teachers I heard last year that she shared with the students that no, only 2 presidents have been impeached, not 3. And she's a civics teacher. I know parents who immediately went to the principal and said, wait a second, is that not indoctrination of another type? And so advocating for the teachers who want to push back, but also as a parent, stepping up and say, this won't go on in the classroom with my child. I think you can use the anti-woke against what it was intended.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I am not a teacher, I never have been, but I was a student in public schools, and I'm currently a parent of a public school student. So I think here, again, we have both history and constitutional text on our side. And so to the extent that there are resources, including just teaching the text of the Constitution, it is ironic, I think, that there is a very strong textualist and originalist argument for separation of church and state that can be made by teachers in this place. So I am a lawyer and I'm not giving legal advice, but I think that teachers in these situations are caught in an incredibly difficult situation. But I do think that just teaching straight constitutional law here as civics is preferable to teaching whatever propaganda is coming from these current trainings.
So you have the microphone, so I'll ask the next question, and this could take us another hour, but a attendee writes, what role do you see the Supreme Court playing in promoting Christian nationalism?
One of the problems of the current Supreme Court is that while we're seeing this incredible rising tide of Christian nationalism, we are seeing them take down the legal and constitutional protections for separation of church and state. If you missed it last term, in addition to the hugely consequential Dobbs decision that I saw this church is hosting a conversation on in just a couple of weeks, there were 2 hugely consequential decisions for religious freedom at the end of the term as well. One of them had to do with public funding for religious schools and religious instruction in religious schools, which the Supreme Court said is required if the state is also giving public funding to private schools that aren't teaching religion. This is the first time this has ever happened in the constitutional law, that the court is requiring, in certain situations, public funding of religion. This is incredibly concerning. and could have huge consequences for funding of public education. Less than a week later, they had another decision in which they upheld and found a free exercise right for a public school high school coach who had a history of leading his students in Christian prayer. This goes against 60 years of constitutional law where the Supreme Court had said there would not be government-sponsored prayer in public schools. An incredibly important protection for religious freedom. Because again, the government is unqualified in teaching and leading in religion in our public schools. Parents of all religious faiths and none should feel comfortable that they can send their child to public school without worrying about their child being indoctrinated in any religion while they are at public school. We no longer have the assurance from the Supreme Court that we have constitutional protections. So we have to pay attention to what's going on at the Supreme Court. My takeaway from all of this, and I will put in a plug here, I am a co-host of a podcast called Respecting Religion, where we talk about all of these Supreme Court cases and other places that we see religion in the law. So we go into a lot more details on both those cases and other cases at the court. But my big takeaway, and we've known this for some time, but last term made it clear, we cannot rely on the United States Supreme Court to protect our constitutional rights in many different places. But here's my hope. The U.S. Constitution starts with we the people, right? It is up to we the people to protect each other's constitutional rights. And so that is where fighting against Christian nationalism is so important right now. And I think we'll look back on this period of history that is ending as a place where we had grown somewhat, I'm speaking as a white American, we had grown somewhat complacent about our rights. And we can't be complacent anymore. And we have taken a more active role in defending our democracy.
And with that, I want to close our time together. We tried to hit the high spots of the themes of the cards that you sent in. If I did not get to your question, I will be glad to say that Amanda will be here a few moments after we dismiss here in a moment if you want to talk with her. And again, all of the resources that she brought forth. A card came in and it reads, "As an atheist, I appreciate your advocacy on this issue. I think as human beings, we all appreciate all three of you and your advocacy. Would you join me in welcoming and thanking our guests?" And I'll close with a thought that was written in on a card. You've probably heard it. The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good persons to do nothing. I think that you know by the very convening of this conversation tonight that there are organizations that are trying to do something. That's what we do at OneJax. That's what we do at South Jacksonville Presbyterian Church. It's what we do at the Interfaith Center. It's what we do at the BJC. It's what we do with our faith communities. There are community organizations out there. We need your support. We need your help in all the ways that you can. And let's continue on the good fight. Thank you so much for being a part of our time tonight.